It was just another Saturday in New York City, March 25, 1911. The sidewalks of Manhattan pulsed with life carriages rattling, street vendors calling, the chatter of thousands of immigrants chasing the promise of the American dream inside. The Ash Building on the corner of Washington Place and Green Street, nearly 500 young women bent over sewing machines. Most were immigrants, Jewish and Italian girls, some barely teenagers stitching shirtwaists for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. They worked in rows so tight their elbows touched. The air was thick with lint scraps of fabric piled high, oil lamps burning dangerously close, but this was normal. In 1911, this was progress. The garment industry was booming, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was its crown jewel. The women dreamed of wages sent home, of families fed, of better days. Outside the city climbed skyward steel and stone, rising into modern towers. Inside, life was measured in stitches per minute. But progress had a cost. Doors were locked to prevent theft. Exits were chained to keep workers in line. Fire escapes were flimsy, elevators unreliable. The building was a monument to profit, not to safety. And then, sometime after 4:40 in the afternoon, the dream turned to fire. A spark, a pile of cloth and flames that leapt faster than anyone could run. What began as an ordinary workday ended as one of the darkest chapters in American labor history. By sunset, 146 lives would be gone. This is not just the story of a fire, it's the story of a city, a system, and the human cost of progress written in ash. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a dream wrapped in chains, perched on the top 3 floors of the Ash Building. It was one of the largest garment operations in New York City. Nearly 500 workers filled its rooms, most of them young immigrant women from Italy, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Many were barely out of childhood. Some had crossed the Atlantic alone. All of them carried the weight of families depending on the dollars they earned. For these women, Triangle was a step into America, a chance to prove themselves, to carve out a life in a city that promised endless opportunity. They stitched shirtwaists, the fashionable blouses of the day, garments that symbolized freedom for middle-class women who wore them, yet the workers who sewed them lived anything but free. Inside the factory, reality cut sharper than any needle. The rows of sewing machines were so tight that elbows brushed as the women bent over their work. Piles of cloth crowded the floors, dust and fabric. Lint choked the air, brakes were scarce. The hours long, 12, sometimes 14 in a single stretch. For all this, most earned just a few dollars a week, and always the doors were locked to prevent theft, locked to control workers, locked so no one could leave without permission. It was the American dream colliding with industrial exploitation, a place where ambition was trapped by fireproof walls that were anything but safe. The men who owned the factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were called the Shirtwaist Kings. To them, Triangle was an empire of cloth and profit. To the women at the machines, it was survival bought at the cost of exhaustion. Yet, despite the grinding monotony, there was resilience. The women laughed in their own languages, shared food in small tin pails, whispered about families across the ocean. For many, Triangle was not just work, it was community. But community could not soften the chains, the locked exits, the flimsy fire escapes, the crowded stairwells. All of it lay waiting like kindling ignored in the rush for profit. No one knew it yet, but the very conditions that defined daily life inside the Triangle Factory would soon define its tragedy. Because in the spring of 1911, the dream these women had chased was about to be swallowed by flames. March 25th, 1911. A Saturday for most of New York, it was the start of the weekend. For the women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, it was just another long day. Rows of sewing machines clattered as they raced to finish orders. The floor was littered with scraps of cotton, dry, thin, and highly flammable. At 4:40 in the afternoon, a spark ignited. Some say it was a cigarette carelessly flicked into a bin of fabric. Others blame a match. No one knows for certain. But within seconds, a small flame leapt to life beneath a cutting table on the 8th floor. And then the fire ran wild. The scraps on the floor ignited like paper flames, climbed up the piles of shirtwaists stacked high. Workers screamed as orange light swallowed the room. The air filled with choking black smoke so thick that women dropped their work and stumbled blindly for exits that would not open. A fire spread with terrifying speed from one corner of the 8th floor to the next. The blaze leapt from fabric to wood to bodies in less than 3 minutes. The factory, packed with cloth and oil-soaked machines, was a furnace waiting to burn workers. Dashed toward the stairwell, but one door was locked, bolted from the outside. The other opened inward, trapping dozens as the crowd pressed desperately against it. Panic turned the narrow hall into chaos. On the 9th floor they saw smoke rising and thought it was a drill. But then the fire was at their heels. Women ran to the windows, coughing, eyes streaming with tears. Some clawed at the locked exit, others tried the rickety fire escape, only to find it buckling under their weight. On the 10th floor, clerks and managers watched in horror as the inferno roared upward. A few escaped across rooftops to neighboring buildings, but for the women below, escape was nearly impossible. The flames moved faster than the workers could run. In minutes, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory became a death trap, and the city outside had no idea. From Washington Square, bystanders first saw smoke curling into the sky. Then came the sight that would haunt New York forever. Faces pressed against the glass, women pounding on windows, their cries. Muffled by fire, the blaze had begun, and before it was over, it would claim 146 lives. The fire should not have been a massacre, but greed had locked the doors on the 8th and 9th floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The main exit doors were bolted shut from the outside. Owners insisted it was to prevent theft, to stop workers from sneaking out with fabric. Others say it was to block union organizers who had been agitating for safer conditions. Whatever the reason, in those final moments it became a death sentence. Hundreds of women surged toward the exits, only to find them sealed. They clawed at the handles, slammed their shoulders against the frames, screamed for help. That never came behind them. The flames closed in, devouring everything in their path. The fire escape, a thin, rickety structure bolted to the side of the building, quickly became overcrowded. Dozens piled onto it, desperate for air, but the metal was old, weak, and never built to handle the weight of so many. With a groan, it twisted and collapsed. Dozens of women fell with it, crashing into the alley below. Inside, others turned to the elevators. Operators risked their lives running the lifts up and down as long as they could. Women packed inside, weeping, gasping, begging to be saved, but the elevators jammed. The heat warped the cables, and when they failed, some women hurled themselves down the shafts, hoping for a quicker death than the fire's slow suffocation. The stairwells became ovens, flames surged upward, choking smoke pressing down with every breath. Those trapped there collapsed in piles, their hands still clutching one another, as the fire overtook them, and then came the most terrible choice of all. At the windows, dozens of women stood pressed against the glass. Behind them, the flames roared closer. Ahead of them, 10 stories of open air. Some prayed, some screamed, others held hands. And then one by one they jumped. Bystanders below watched in horror as bodies rained down into the street. Dresses ballooned like parachutes, then crumpled on impact. Less than half an hour, the sidewalks of Washington Place were littered with dead. The women of Triangle were not just trapped by fire. They were trapped by locked doors, by failed escapes, by greed that valued bolts and profits over lives. In those final minutes, their choices were reduced to 3: burn, suffocate, or leap into the void. The streets of New York were never silent, but on March 25, 1911, they fell into a stunned hush, broken only by the sound of bodies hitting the pavement. Crowds gathered below the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, craning their necks, shielding their eyes against the thick smoke that poured from the upper floors. What they saw was unimaginable. At the windows, women appeared in clusters. Some screamed for help, pounding the glass with their fists. Others pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. Coughing, choking. The fire was behind them. The street was below them. And there was nowhere else to go. And then, one by one, they began to jump. Eyewitnesses described it as a rain of bodies. Dresses flared in the air, catching the wind for an instant before collapsing to the street. Some fell alone, others held hands, leaping together. A few even wrapped their arms around one another, unwilling to face death alone. Young man was seen helping women climb onto the sills, steadying them before they leapt. He kissed one. Perhaps his sweetheart before she stepped into the void. Moments later, he followed her. Below, onlookers gasped and screamed. Police officers tried to hold back the crowd as more bodies fell, striking the pavement, striking even the fire nets hastily stretched by rescuers, but the nets tore like paper under the force of the falls. The fire engines arrived quickly, their horses galloping through the streets, bells clanging. But when firefighters raised their ladders, they only reached the 6th floor. The women trapped on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors were too high out of reach, left to choose between fire and air. One witness said it was like watching birds fall from the sky. But they were not birds, they were girls. Newspapers called it a rain of bodies. Photographs of the aftermath would sear themselves into the nation's conscience. Rows of lifeless young women piled on the cobblestones where they had landed. The fire did not just consume the Triangle factory, it consumed the city's sense of safety. The sidewalks of Washington Place became an open grave witnessed by thousands, and above the smoldering buildings, smoke and silence marked the terrible truth. New York had watched its daughters fall from the sky. The fire was over, the bodies were buried, the mourning had begun, but the city of New York demanded something more. Justice at the center of it all were two men, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, known as the Shirtwaist Kings, they had built their empire on the backs of immigrant women, and in the eyes of many on the ashes of the 146 who had died. Within weeks, Blank and Harris were indicted for manslaughter. The charge was clear: the locked doors, the missing fire escapes, the lack of safety. Measures had trapped their workers in a death trap. If found guilty, they would face prison. Trial began in December 1911, less than 9 months after the fire survivors were called to testify. Women with scarred hands and broken voices stood in the witness box, recalling the panic, the locked exits, the desperate screams. One survivor swore she had tried the door herself and it would not open. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The city held its breath, but in the courtroom justice faltered. The defense attorneys tore apart survivor testimonies, questioning memories blurred by smoke and terror. They painted the owners not as villains but as victims of circumstance. The doors, they argued, might not have been locked. Perhaps workers had panicked. Perhaps no one was truly to blame. In the end, the jury sided with the factory owners. The verdict: not guilty. The reasoned lack of proof. Max Blank and Isaac Harris walked free for the families of the dead. The verdict was another wound. Mothers wept in the gallery, fathers shouted in rage. Reporters filled the newspapers with bitter headlines. The sense of betrayal was palpable. One headline declared 146 dead and no one to blame. To many, the trial proved what they already knew: in an America ruled by industry profits, spoke louder than lives. Blank and Harris later paid small civil settlements to the victims' families, just $75 per life. A pitiful price for the daughters of New York. Justice had failed, but the outrage it sparked would ignite something greater than a courtroom verdict. The trial may have ended in silence, but outside those walls, a movement was gathering its voice. The trial had failed. Justice had slipped through the cracks of the courtroom, but outside in the streets of New York, the fire's victims refused to be forgotten. Outrage was immediate. Tens of thousands marched in funeral processions for the dead, black banners fluttering against the grey skyline. Mothers carried photographs of daughters, workers carried signs demanding change. The grief of a city transformed into a rallying cry. Out of the ashes of the Triangle fire, a new movement rose. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, grew in power and voice. Women who had once been silent behind sewing machines now stood at podiums demanding safe workplaces, shorter hours, and dignity in labor. Strikes and protests swept across the garment industry, fueled by the memory of the locked doors on the 9th floor. And among the witnesses that day was a woman who would change American history. Frances Perkins, then a young social worker, stood in the crowd as bodies fell from the factory windows. She would later call it the day that changed her life. 2 decades later, as Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, she would carry that memory into the halls of power. Perkins became the first woman to serve in a U.S. cabinet, and the architect of sweeping labor reforms. The fire's legacy was written into law. New York passed over 30 new workplace safety statutes in the years that followed. Mandatory fire drills, unlocked doors during work hours, fireproof stairwells, sprinklers in high-rise factories. Inspectors gained the right to enter and regulate workplaces, and the balance of power began to shift from unchecked industrialists to the workers who risked their lives inside there. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire had killed 146 people in less than half an hour, but in its aftermath, it saved thousands more. The tragedy became a turning point in America's labor history, a moment when suffering, forced reform, when the cries of immigrant women shaped the laws of a nation, and though the flames burned out that March afternoon, their light illuminated a path forward, one built on sacrifice, struggle, and the promise that never again would workers be left to die behind locked doors. They were young, most were women, some were only 14. They came to America chasing the promise of a better life. Daughters of Italian and Jewish immigrants carrying needles and thread instead of books or toys. For long hours they stitched shirts in dim rooms, believing that hard work would open the door to the American dream. But on March 25, 1911, that dream went up in flames. In less than half an hour, 146 lives were gone, mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. Their names etched into history, not for what they created, but for how they died, locked in, abandoned, and left with no choice but to leap into the arms of death. And yet from their ashes something powerful rose. Their loss forced a nation look inward to confront the price of unchecked greed. Their sacrifice became the foundation for fire codes, labor protections, and workplace safety laws that continue to save lives today. But memory is fragile. The story of Triangle is often forgotten, buried beneath headlines and skyscrapers. Still, its voices remain, whispering through every fire alarm test, every sprinkler system, every unlocked exit door, because this was more than a fire. It was a question. The fire is gone, but the questions remain. How many lives must be lost before safety is no longer an afterthought?